Hello and welcome. Today let's talk chapter 11 and we'll go through the human organization and we'll talk about tissues focusing on all the four primary tissue types here then. Now when we go through and we talk tissues, first I'd like you to know when we talk about the hierarchy we've seen cells are composed of molecules. Then we talk cells, we'll see similar types of cells are going to come together to form tissues. And when we talk tissues, tissues come together to form an organ. And we talk organs, organs we'll see then are going to come together and make up organ systems to eventually make up the human or the organism. Now, when we talk tissues, a tissue is composed of similarly specialized cells that are going to perform a common function in the body. So when we talk tissues, tissues are composed of similarly specialized cells that perform a common function in the body. There are four types of tissues making up the human body. Now here we can appreciate those four. We have first epithelial tissue. Second, we have connective tissue. Third, we have muscular tissue. Fourth, we have nervous tissue. We'll go through each of these tissues and we'll check them all out in greater detail. So again, we said two or more primary tissue types make up an organ. So if we talk about an organ is made up of at least two of these primary tissue types we see here. Well, more commonly, we'll see four. Now, when we talk tissue types, first, epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is going to be found covering our body surfaces and lining our body's cavities. Connective tissue next, then. Connective tissue supports and binds body parts. When we talk muscular tissue, third type, muscular tissue is going to move the body and its parts. Fourth type is nervous tissue. Nervous tissue receives stimuli and it processes that information, it processes those stimuli, and then it conducts an appropriate response. It conducts an impulse. So what we'll do first is we'll focus on epithelial tissue, and then we'll move on through each of the other tissue types there as well. Now, when we talk epithelial tissue is also known as epithelium. It is also known as epithelium. Now, epithelial tissue is going to be found as tightly packed cells that are going to form a continuous layer. So, epithelial tissue is also known as epithelium. Its cells are tightly packed and they form a continuous layer. Now, epithelial tissue, we said, covers our body surfaces and lines our body's cavities. Now, when we talk about its functions, you can see here first, epithelium has a protective function, but it can also carry out secretion, absorption, excretion, and filtration. On the external surface, it protects the body from injury, drying out, and possible invasion by bacteria and viruses. Now, on the internal surfaces, epithelial tissue can secrete mucus along the digestive tract. Epithelial tissue is going to be classified according to the shape of the cells it's composed of. So when we talk about the shape of the cells, we'll see we can have squamous shaped epithelium, or we can have cuboidal shaped epithelium, or we can have columnar epithelium. So according to shape, squamous epithelium, they're flattened cells. Cuboidal epithelium, they're going to be cube-shaped cells. And then columnar epithelium, column-shaped cells. And they resemble rectangular pillars you can think of. So that's one way we can classify our epithelial tissue. And the other way is according to the number of layers in the tissue. According to the number of layers in the tissue. Now, when we talk classification according to the number of layers in the tissue, we can see we can have a few types. First, we can have what we call simple epithelium. We can have simple epithelium. Simple epithelium is going to be a single layer of cells. We can have stratified epithelium, where we're going to see multiple cell layers, where we have two or more cell layers. And third, then we can have pseudostratified epithelium. Pseudostratified, now if we break down the word pseudostratified, we can see this epithelium, it appears to be layered, but each cell touches the basement membrane. So this is going to be made up of cells that have different heights. Cells that are of differing heights, you can think of. So pseudo, stratified. Pseudo means false, false stratified. Next then, let's go through and let's look at epithelial tissue more specifically then. So first, when we talk more specifically, we can have what we call squamous cells, the squamous epithelium. Squamous epithelium, I want you to know, looks like flattened cells. Looks like flattened cells. And squamous epithelium is going to be found lining the lungs and our blood vessels. When we talk cuboidal epithelium is going to be made up of cube-shaped cells, and they're going to line our kidneys' tubules. And then we have columnar epithelium. Columnar epithelium resembles rectangular pillars, we said, or columns. And their nuclei are at the bottom of the cell, and these cells are going to be found lining the digestive tract. We also have ciliated columnar, which is going to have cilia associated with it. Ciliated columnar is going to be found lining the oviducts, lining the fallopian tubes. Now, we said classification is going to be also based on the number of layers in the tissue. So simple epithelium has a single layer of cells, we said, whereas stratified epithelium has layers of cells that are piled on top of one another, 2 or more layers, we said. Next, let's talk simple squamous epithelium in more detail. Simple squamous epithelium is going to be found making up the lining of our lungs, also our blood vessels, lining our blood vessels. And its function here, you can see it says protect. Protection is not correct. It's not the type that we want for protection. This epithelium is going to be the type that allows for diffusion. It allows for diffusion of substances across the surface. Next, let's talk about simple cuboidal epithelium. We can see simple cuboidal epithelium is going to be found lining our kidneys' tubules and making up various glands. Its job is going to be to absorb molecules. It absorbs molecules. Next, then we have simple columnar. When we talk simple columnar is going to be found lining the small intestine and lining the oviducts. And it absorbs nutrients. Its job is to absorb nutrients. And we can see we also have here then stratified squamous epithelium. Now, when we talk stratified squamous epithelium, it's going to be found making up the skin, more specifically speaking, the epidermis of the skin. So that's this layer right up in here. This is the epithelial layer. Everything down here then is the connective tissue layer. So the basement membrane would be right inside of here, right in this area, right in here, which you see right down here in this picture. And when you talk functions, it's also going to be found lining our nose, mouth, esophagus, the anal canal, and the vagina. The reason why is because we can see is protects, is that it protects. Next, we can see we also have pseudostratified ciliated epithelium. Pseudostratified ciliated epithelium is going to be found lining our trachea, lining our windpipe, our trachea. And its function is to sweep impurities towards the throat, where then they could be removed by coughing. These cells, the pseudostratified epithelium, also have goblet cells found in between them. And these goblet cells are going to be mucus-secreting cells. They're mucus-secreting cells. Next, then, let's move to our glands. When we talk about our glands, I'd like you to know when epithelium secretes a product, it is said to be glandular. A gland can be a single epithelial cell, or a gland may contain many cells. Glands that secrete their products into ducts are called exocrine glands, and those that secrete their products into the bloodstream are going to be called endocrine glands. Now, when we talk, you can see here, again, glands can be single-celled or they can be made up of multiple cells. So there then we can see they'll be called multicellular glands versus unicellular glands. Now, when we go back and we talk about our goblet cells are going to be examples of unicellular glands. Our glands can be classified into two different classifications here. We can see first we have exocrine glands, again, which secrete their products into ducts. So here when we say secrete their products into ducts, so here we can see our surface epithelium, and then here we can see basically, we'll say it continues over on this side. Now in here, we can say we've got basically a gland, let's say. So this part of the gland, we'll say from here down to about here, is the actual secretory portion. It's the actual part that secretes, the secretory portion. And then we'll say this part right inside of here, from here down to about here, this is the duct of the gland. So now when we say our gland secretes, right? Exocrine glands are going to secrete their products into ducts. So this is an example of an exocrine gland. This is the secretory part of the gland, and this is the duct of the gland. And so here you can see is the surface epithelium. You can think of, or basically the cavity. So here you've got the duct. Now these glands, when they secrete their products are going to go into the duct. So here's the same thing we'll have on this side. We'll say the duct is here. And so the secretion is going to make its way from here up into this duct. And then from this duct, those secretions are going to make their way out and into the cavity or onto the surface. So you can see here they secrete their products into ducts. And then those secretions make their way into the cavity or onto the surface. Now, endocrine glands, they're going to secrete their products right into the bloodstream, we said, right into the bloodstream. The pancreas, we'll see one example. The pancreas we can see is an example of a mixed gland. It's got both exocrine and endocrine tissue in it. So it's a mixed gland. It's an exocrine and an endocrine gland. So that's all epithelial tissue. So you can see it's found almost everywhere in the body. Now, before we take off, let's talk about junctions between epithelial cells. We have three different types of junctions we can find in between our epithelial cells. The first type are tight junctions. Now, when we talk tight junctions, they form an impermeable barrier because adjacent plasma membrane proteins actually join together. So therefore, you have tight junctions. Now, gap junctions we'll see are the second type. Gap junctions, they form when two adjacent plasma membrane channels join. And this allows then the cells to communicate with each other. Third type then are adhesion junctions. They're going to be found where the adjacent plasma membranes do not touch, but they are held together by intracellular filaments that are firmly attached to the cytoplasmic plaques. And they help to keep those two cells together. So let's check out connective tissue. Now, when we talk connective tissue binds organs together. It provides support and protection. It helps fill spaces. It produces blood cells and stores fat, to name a few functions. Connective tissue cells are dispersed in a matrix, which is basically a non-cellular material whose consistency varies from solid to jelly-like to fluid. A non-fluid matrix may contain three fiber types. First, we can have collagen fibers. Collagen fibers contain this protein collagen, and collagen helps to give whatever organ that these tissues are going to be associated with flexibility and strength. Second type are our elastic fibers. Elastic fibers contain this protein called elastin. This is a protein that is not as strong as collagen. However, it's more elastic. So whatever organ elastic tissue is going to be found associated with, it will be more elastic. Third type are our reticular fibers. The reticular fibers are very thin fibers, and they are highly branched fibers that form supporting networks. So next, let's move into the various types of connective tissues. The first types we'll talk about are going to be loose, fibrous, and dense fibrous connective tissues. When we talk loose fibrous supports epithelium and also many internal organs. Its presence in the lungs, arteries, and the urinary bladder allows these organs to expand. Loose fibrous connective tissue also forms a protective covering over many internal organs like our muscles, our blood vessels, and our nerves. Dense fibrous contains many collagen fibers. This tissue is found in tendons, which connect muscles to bones, and in ligaments, which connect bones to other bones at our joints. Both of these tissues have cells called fibroblasts. Next, then, let's appreciate these two tissue types under the microscope. So here we can see first loose fibrous connective tissue. In loose fibrous connective tissue, you can appreciate the collagen fibers. Here are elastic fibers. And then we have fibroblast nuclei. Fibroblast nuclei. So this connective tissue, it has space between the components, you can see. It occurs beneath the skin and most epithelial layers. And it functions to support and bind organs. So again, fibroblasts, very important cells you've got there. Next then we've got dense fibrous connective tissue. Dense fibrous connective tissue, you can see, contains many collagen fibers. These are all collagen fibers you see here. And in between these collagen fibers, you can appreciate fibroblast nuclei in certain locations. Fibroblast nuclei. And this tissue is going to have many specialized functions, and it occurs in our tendons and ligaments, we said. Next, then, let's move over to adipose and reticular connective tissue. So here we can appreciate adipose and reticular connective tissue. Adipose is where you have the storage of fat. Our adipocytes are going to be responsible for storing fat. The body then uses this fat for stored energy, insulation, and organ protection. It's found beneath the skin, around the kidneys, and on the surface of the heart. Next, then, we have reticular connective tissue. When we talk reticular connective tissue forms the meshwork of lymphoid tissue in our lymph nodes, in our spleen, in our thymus, and in our bone marrow. All types of blood cells are produced in red bone marrow, but a certain type called our T lymphocytes, are going to complete their development in the thymus. So here we can appreciate adipose tissue. We've got one adipocyte. Here's half of an adipocyte. Here's another adipocyte. And then down here, half of another adipocyte. So 3, 4 almost adipocytes making up adipose tissue. And we can see our fibroblasts are going to basically enlarge, and then they start to store fat. And when they store the fat, what happens is the nucleus and the other organelles that are inside the cell, they get pushed off to the side. They get pushed off to the periphery of the cell. So that's why here you can appreciate the nucleus right over here on the side. And for this cell, here's its nucleus. And then we can see here, for this cell, it looks like it could be this nucleus. And then this nucleus could be from another cell. The cell didn't get picked up because we've got to remember this is a slide. It's not a picture, so it's not picture perfect. We get whatever comes up on the slide. Here then we've got cartilage next. Cartilage is a specialized form of dense fibrous connective tissue. It most commonly forms the smooth surfaces that allow bones to slide against each other in our joints. The cells of cartilage tissue are going to be found lying in small chambers that we call lacuna. This tissue lacks a direct blood supply, and therefore it heals very slowly. There are three types of cartilage that I would like you to know about. First type we can see is hyaline, second is elastic, and third is fibrocartilage. Let's talk first hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is the most common type. It contains only very fine collagen fibers. Hyaline cartilage we can see is going to be found in the nose and also the ends of our long bones and our ribs. It forms rings in the walls of our respiratory passages. And it forms, we can see, part of the fetal skeleton, which will then become bone from this tissue. Second, then we have elastic cartilage. Elastic cartilage has a high proportion of elastic fibers, so you can see it's more flexible. And it's going to help form the framework of the outer ear and our epiglottis. The third type then is fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage has strong collagen fibers. This type of cartilage is going to be found in structures that withstand tension and pressure, such as the intervertebral discs and the wedges in our knee joints. Next, then let's move on to bone tissue. Now, when we talk bone tissue is the most rigid connective tissue. When we talk bone, we have two types. We have compact bone and we have spongy bone. Let's talk about compact bone then in greater detail. Now, when we talk compact bone makes up the shaft of a long bone. Its structural units are called osteons. And bone cells, we'll see, are going to be found in spaces called lacunae. And the central canal is going to contain nerve fibers and blood vessels. These central canals, then, we're going to see are going to be surrounded by rings of hard matrix. And when we talk about the shaft of our long bones, such as our femur bone, we'll say, I'd like you to know that it's going to be filled with bone marrow. This is going to be a site where blood cells develop. Then we talk about the ends of our long bones. The ends of our long bones are going to contain spongy bone, which is designed to give bones strength, and we'll go over that in a few seconds. So here when we talk compact bone, we said it forms the shafts of our long bones. It's going to consist of cylindrical structures called osteons. And then the central canals of each osteon is surrounded by rings of hard matrix. And again, the cells are going to be found located in spaces called lacunae. Next, when we talk spongy bone is going to contain many bony bars and plates. It's separated by irregular spaces, and it's going to be found in the ends of our long bones. And even though this bone is lighter, it's still designed for strength. So here we can appreciate a nice slide of our bone. Here you can see we've got one osteon, and at the center of the osteon is a central canal. And right here is where you're going to be able to appreciate the blood vessels. And here we can see the lacunae. And again, we said they're responsible for housing our bone cells. All right, next then let's talk about blood. When we talk blood is going to help transport nutrients and oxygen to tissue fluid and remove carbon dioxide and other wastes. Now, when we go through and we talk about blood, there are various components of blood that are going to protect us from disease, and also blood's ability to clot prevents fluid loss. If we get blood, put it into a tube, right, and centrifuge it, spin it at a high rate, we'll be able to separate its components and we'll see we'll have the upper layer being made up of plasma. And this layer of plasma represents about 55% of the volume of whole blood. The lower layer we see down here is going to consist of red blood cells. This lower layer consists of red blood cells, our erythrocytes. Then we've got white blood cells, our leukocytes, and our platelets. And they're going to be found here in this coat between the plasma and the red blood cells. Collectively, you can see we can refer to the white blood cells, the platelets, and the red blood cells as formed elements. And they represent about 45% of the volume of blood. Red blood cells are small, you can see right down here. They're small disc-shaped cells without nuclei. They do not have nuclei. They are filled with hemoglobin, which is a red pigment, helps to make blood red, and it's responsible for transporting oxygen. When we talk white blood cells, we can see various white blood cells here. White blood cells are usually larger and have a nucleus. White blood cells will fight infections a number of different ways. Next, then we have our platelets. We'll see the platelets and our red blood cells are not considered true cells. Platelets and our red blood cells are not complete cells. When we talk platelets, they are fragments of a larger cell. Now, what platelets are going to do is they're going to help to form a plug that seals damaged vessels, and they stimulate clotting. Let's move to muscular tissue. Now, when we talk muscular tissue is going to be composed of cells called muscle fibers. Muscle fibers contain actin and myosin filaments, whose interaction, so when actin and myosin interact, this accounts for our overall movement. There are three types of muscle tissues that you'll be responsible for knowing about. There are three types of muscle tissue. Let's talk first skeletal muscle. So we can move forward. Here we have a nice picture depicting to a skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is usually attached by tendons to the bones of the skeleton, and when it contracts, body parts move. Contraction of skeletal muscle is under voluntary nervous control. When we talk individual skeletal muscle fibers, here you can see one skeletal muscle fiber. Skeletal muscle fibers are cylindrical and long. They arise from the fusion of several cells, which makes them multinucleate cells, meaning they have multiple nuclei. These fibers, they have alternating light and dark bands that give them then this striated appearance. So here you can see dark band, then right next to it light band, dark band, light band, dark band, light band, and this gives this fiber a striated appearance. Next, then we have smooth muscle. When we talk smooth muscle lacks striations. It does not have striations, hence the name smooth muscle. And it is not under voluntary control. Smooth muscle is going to be found in the walls of our visceral organs and our blood vessels. So here we can see the stomach, the intestines, right, to name a few organs. Third, then we have cardiac muscle. When we talk cardiac muscle is found only in the walls of the heart. Now, cardiac muscle also has striations, and cardiac muscle is under involuntary control. So we do not consciously control this muscle's contraction. Next, I'd like you to know cardiac muscle cells are separate and individual cells. They are connected to other cardiac muscle cells at intercalated discs. So here you can see the intercalated discs, and this is where then the two cardiac muscle cells will come together. So next then let's talk about nervous tissue. Now when we talk nervous tissue contains nerve cells that are called neurons, and it is present in the brain and spinal cord. A neuron, I'd like you to know, is a specialized cell that has three basic parts to it. First, we'll see it has a cell body to it. The cell body is also called the soma, and the cell body is going to contain cytoplasm and the nucleus of the neuron. The cytoplasm is also going to be able to receive incoming signals. Next, then we have our dendrites. A dendrite, I'd like you to know, is a process that conducts signals towards the cell body. It conducts signals towards the cell body. We'll see when we talk about our dendrites, we can have anywhere from one to multiple dendrites in relation to our neurons. Next, then we have our axon. When we talk about an axon is a process that conducts nerve impulses away from the cell body. Axons are going to be usually long. Long axons are covered, we'll see, by myelin, which is a whitish, fatty substance. And what it does, it increases the speed of nerve impulses. The nervous system has three basic functions, and they will include, number one, sensory input. Number two, then, is integration. And number three, we'll see, is motor output. Nerves conduct impulses from our sensory receptors to the spinal cord and the brain, where then integration takes place. Nerves also conduct nerve impulses away from the spinal cord and brain to the muscles and our glands, causing them then to contract and secrete. Now, when we talk nervous tissue is also going to contain neuroglia. These cells outnumber our neurons, and they're going to support and nourish our neurons. You have four neuroglia in relation to the brain and the spinal cord, in relation to the CNS. And they're going to include, number one, your microglial cells. When we talk about your microglial cells, these cells are going to be responsible for engulfing bacteria and cellular debris. They engulf bacteria and cellular debris. Number two, then we have our astrocytes. When we talk astrocytes, they're going to provide nutrients to our neurons. And then number three, we have our oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes are able to produce myelin for multiple axons. Next, then we have our ependymal cells. Our ependymal cells are cells that line the fluid-filled spaces in the brain and the spinal cord. So here we can see the neuron and three cells. Here we've got our astrocytes. You can see here they're connected to the nutrient supply line, where they're able to extract the nutrients and then send them off to the neurons. We've got our oligodendrocytes producing myelin. And then finally, you can appreciate your microglial cells. Nice photograph of the neuron. Let's talk body cavities and body membranes. When we refer to anatomical parts of humans, we use certain terms and we refer to the body in an upright, standing position, as we can see these pictures in here are depicting. This anatomical position is an upright, standing position where we could see the palms and the face and the feet are facing forward. The term ventral, which also means anterior in humans, refers to the front, and dorsal or posterior both mean towards the back of the body, towards the back. Then is the term superior. Superior means towards the head. And then we have inferior. Inferior means towards the feet. Medial is closer to the midline of the body, whereas lateral means away from the midline of the body. Now, when referring to appendages like an arm or a leg, proximal means closer to the trunk of the body. So here you can see this part is the proximal end, and then my wrist is all the distal end. So here we can see the body is divided into two main cavities, the ventral cavity and the dorsal cavity. We can see them here. This ventral cavity is further subdivided into, we can see the thoracic cavity, the abdominal cavity, and then the pelvic cavity. When we talk thoracic cavity is going to contain the lungs and the heart. Abdominal cavity is going to contain the stomach, the liver, the spleen, the gallbladder, right, and most of the small and large intestines. And then we talk pelvic cavity is going to contain the rectum, the urinary bladder, and reproductive organs. Now the first two we can see are separated from each other thanks to the diaphragm muscle. The dorsal body cavity can be divided into the cranial cavity number 1, which is going to contain the brain. And then here we can see the vertebral canal, which will house the spinal cord, which will contain the spinal cord. Your mucous membranes are going to be found lining the tubes of your digestive, respiratory, urinary, and reproductive systems. They're composed of an epithelium that's going to be stacked on top of connective tissue, more specifically speaking, loose fibrous connective tissue. The epithelium is going to contain goblet cells, and the goblet cells secrete mucus. Second, then we have our serous membranes. When we talk our serous membranes, they're going to be found lining the thoracic and the abdominal cavities, and they're going to cover the organs those cavities contain. These membranes, they're also composed of epithelium that's going to rest on top of loose fibrous connective tissue. These membranes secrete a watery fluid for lubrication, and we'll see they're going to be named according to their location, where they're going to be found. First, we have what we call the pleura, and you can see the pleura is going to be found lining the thoracic cavity and the lungs. And then second, we have the pericardium, which encloses the heart. And then last, we have peritoneum, which is going to be lining the abdominal cavity and covering its organs. The next membrane I'd like you to know about are synovial membranes. They're made of loose connective tissue, and they're lining our freely movable joints, and they secrete synovial fluid. And then next we have our meninges. The meninges are going to be found lining the dorsal cavity. They protect our brain and spinal cord, and they also are made up of connective tissue. Next in here we can see our organ systems. We have all these various organ systems, and we're going to have chapters basically dedicated to each of these organ systems, sometimes even 2 or 3 chapters. And I want you to go through each of these organ systems and know which organs make up the systems and know their basic functions. So first we can start with integumentary. You can see it protects the body, it receives sensory input, it helps control temperature, and it's responsible for synthesizing vitamin D. Now when you talk integumentary system, it's going to be made up of your hair, skin, and its appendages. So go through every system just like that. Cardiovascular next, heart, blood vessels, and the blood. And here you can see its functions. So I want you to go through again every single one of these systems and make sure you understand that. Next in here we can move along with the integumentary system, the first system. So when we talk integumentary system, we said the skin and its appendages. So the appendages include hair, nails, sweat glands, and oil glands. When we talk integumentary system, you can see its functions are going to include to protect our underlying tissue from trauma. It helps protect us from pathogen invasion and from dehydration. It also helps to regulate body temperature. We said it's involved with synthesizing vitamin D to its active form. And it contains lots of sensory receptors that are going to allow us to be aware of our surroundings. Now, our skin has two main regions to it. You can see it's got first the epidermis, second region is the dermis. The epidermis is the more superficial layer of the two, and it's going to consist of stratified squamous epithelium, as we talked about before. Now, when we talk about this layer of stratified squamous epithelium, we'll see we have basal cells there that are going to be producing new cells that harden and flatten as they're pushed up to the surface by cells that are forming underneath them. We'll see here keratin is going to be a protein that's going to harden and waterproof our cells. And we have melanocytes that are going to produce the pigment melanin, which is going to protect us against UV radiation. When we talk dermis, dermis is the fibrous connective tissue found beneath the epidermis. And it's going to contain collagen fibers that are going to help prevent overstretching and tearing. It also contains elastic fibers that maintain tension, but also stretch to allow movement. We'll see this region contains blood vessels that nourish the skin, and it's going to contain sensory receptors for touch, pain, pressure, and temperature. Beneath the skin, then, we'll have the subcutaneous layer. The components are going to include more connective tissue. So first, loose connective tissue and adipose tissue, which stores fat, which will then give us thermal regulation and energy storage. So here you can appreciate the layers of skin. First, we've got the epidermis right up inside of here. And you can see some places it dips down further. All epidermis up to here. And then beneath here, this is all dermis. All dermis. And then down here we have our subcutaneous layer, or the hypodermis. Or the hypodermis. Now, when we talk about the accessory organs, this includes our nails, which are going to protect the distal parts of our digits, and then they also help pry things open and pick up small objects, to name a few tasks, and even scratch and itch if necessary. When we talk about the structure of the nail is going to have a nail root, a nail body, a cuticle, and a lunula. So here we can appreciate all those parts. So here we can appreciate the nail body. Beneath that is the nail bed. Moving on from the nail body, then you can see the lunula, the cuticle, and then the nail root. So let's talk about each of these regions. So first, then you can see you have the nail root. The nail root is where growth occurs. And growth is going to occur from the epithelial tissue that's in there. Then you have the nail body, which is the actual visible part of the nail, leading us to the cuticle that protects the nail. And then we have the lunula right before we hit the body, which is the white half moon. It's a thick layer of cells. Next, then we have our hair follicles. Our hair follicles extend from the dermis through the epidermis. The hair follicles are going to form from our epidermal cells in the hair root. These cells, they can become keratinized and die as they are pushed away from the root. And then we can see here the contracting erector pili muscle is going to cause the goosebump appearance. And that happens if we're frightened or if we're feeling cold. And then last we can talk our glands. First we have oil glands, and these oil glands are going to be associated with hair follicles. And what they do is they secrete sebum to help lubricate hair and skin. And the last slide here, we can check out our glands. We have various glands. First, our oil glands, and they're going to be associated with hair follicles. They secrete sebum to lubricate hair and skin. When we talk sweat glands, some are going to open into hair follicles, others onto the skin. They'll assist in modifying body temperature by evaporating heat stored in the fluid.